My name is Tina Campt, and it is my pleasure to welcome you back to the conference and to reconvene the important conversation that we began with the opening panel last night. In multiple ways, this morning's panel continues the debate that we began last night. It continues the conversation about the terms that haunt the concept of the vernacular, terms that force us to reckon with the questions of ontological violence Ariella Azoulay raised yesterday regarding the historical violences of the photographic shutter. It questions the erasures and asymmetries raised by Patricia Hayes, in her articulation of the relations between the vernacular and the everyday. And it returns to the provocation posed by Jeff Batchin and echoed by the rest of the panelists as to whether the term vernacular has the same critical purchase it had years ago at the time of its important intervention. Each of these questions and the complicated debates that underlie them are precisely the questions we wanted to explore when we began our initial discussions about organizing this conference. And I think that I speak for my fellow conveners when I say that we are delighted that we are debating them here and now. The title of this morning's panel is Troubling Portraiture, Photographic Portraits and the Shadow Archive. And it references a concept that lies at the center of the debate that began last night, the Shadow Archive. It would be impossible to stage a conference on vernacular photography without engaging Alan Sekula's foundational critical framework of the Shadow Archive. Our panelists this morning directly engage this imperative, but they take it up with a difference and rethink it in the process. Their papers trouble the concept of the Shadow Archive and its adjacent and constituent terms and assumptions. Like Sekula himself, they trouble the binary apportionment of portraiture as repressive or honorific, as well as the very processes for evaluating the gendered and racialized systems of class designation through which they are constructed. They trouble these binaries by supplementing them with urgent and necessary new terms. More specifically, they challenge the fundamental notions of sovereignty on which both the photographic subject, photographic capture, as well as the relationship between the photographic operator and subject are configured. In many ways, in our discussion online, an alternative title to this panel kind of arose, which is The Politics and Poetics of Vernacular Photographic Capture. For each of the papers we will engage this morning extends an invitation to probe what it means to capture an individual in a photograph. What does it mean to capture a subject in an identification photo? What are the limits and subversions of capture of the repressive mugshot or prison photo? Similarly, what are the limits and subversions of the honorific family portrait, especially when that portrait captures a configuration of family that does not enjoy the sovereign privileges of citizenship, middle class, or whiteness? Can we still understand these images through Sekula's terms? Or what other categories shadow the honorific and the repressive in defining photographic portraiture? These are just some of the array of questions our panelists will probe in their presentations this morning. While the topics of their papers diverge, their work converges on their shared interrogation of what constitutes the Shadow Archive in the contemporary moment. Their photographic subjects are equally diverse and in this way offer a critical assessment of the stakes of vernacular photographic capture, both the shadows of the term vernacular as well as the vicissitudes of capture as captivity, captivation, capitulation, and compulsion, as they have been revised and refracted since Sekula's publication. Here we must also ask what constitutes the Shadow Archive in this particular historical moment. How do race, gender, class, citizenship, and captivity trouble these categories and require us to update the concept of the Shadow Archive in our current moment of excessive vernacular capture, surveillance, and policing? In what ways do our creative and strategic engagements with contemporary vernacular photography signal possible practices of refusal of these dominant modalities of capture? These are some of the questions I look forward to exploring in this morning's presentations, though I am sure they will yield numerous others. So without further delay, I'm going to invite our first panelist to the podium. So rather than introduce them individually, you have their long bios. And so I'm going to follow the lead given to us yesterday by simply welcoming each panel consecutively, and we're going to begin with Nicole Fleetwood.
Thank you very much to Tina Campt, Marion Hirsch, and Brian Wallace for organizing this gathering, and to Sarah Softness for all she has done to coordinate and to bring us together. I'm really delighted to be here. I also want to thank my fellow panelists, and I'm looking forward to the conversation that we have today. So my talk today grows out of research that I've been doing for the past several years on visual culture, photography, art made in prisons, and about mass incarceration. And the research has culminated in several ways. Partly, I'm not a trained art historian, but I've gotten involved in art historical practices and curating, and so I've archived lots of the work, and I've programmed through exhibitions some of the work. Most recently, it's a collaboration with the Urban Justice Center and the Corrections Accountability Project here in New York, of an exhibit that's up now at the Urban Justice Center of art made by incarcerated people, and it's on display through November. It's open to the public if you're interested in that. The work is specifically about by incarcerated artists commenting on the prison industrial complex and financial investments in prisons. And then earlier this year, I co-curated and edited a collection with Aperture Foundation called Prison Nation, and it looks at the role of photography in documenting mass incarceration. For me, at heart of with all the work I'm doing is not so much about how non-incarcerated people depict incarceration or incarcerated people, but it's really my interest in thinking about and working with a set of images and practices that come out of states of unfreedom made by incarcerated people as practices of connecting with family, of building relationships, and of ultimately envisioning a world that's where we don't put people in humans in cages. And also at stake, I should say, is a critique of how the history of incarceration and alienation of family members disrupt family life for Blacks, Latinos, poor people, immigrants, and gender nonconforming people as part of the practice of nation building in this country. So as in preparation for today's symposium, the panelists were given access to the Walther collection's vernacular images, and I really appreciate being able to see some of these images that the Walther collection has on mugshots. They have a handful of mugshots from the late 19th century and early 20th century. And I want, even though my paper is not going to be actually based around these images, I actually wanted to start with these images to think about the shadow and the haunt of mugshots actually in the work that incarcerated people do. So among this collection, most of the images are from the U.S. West, notably California and the Northwest, and they're a document of largely the movement West, Manifest Destiny, and the building of the railroads. They are Bertillon-inspired criminal indexes, photographic portraits with measurements and notations, often redacted names of the sitter, and usually they include the individual's crime, where they were arrested or examined. The mugshot portraits here are very much in conversation with the earliest archive that we have, that we know of mugshots in the U.S., and that's a collection that's held at the Missouri History Museum, dating from 1857 to 1867. There are 200 of them, and what they primarily document are poor white immigrants who are arrested for crimes of poverty. In these images, here in the Walther collection and also in Missouri, we have the production of whiteness. And what I mean by that is that the majority of the earliest mugshots are of portraits of white immigrants, hobos, or those who did not adhere to conventions of wage labor and hetero family structures. also remarkably is how their complexions are category of criminal measure, are part of the category of criminal measurement. So you have on their card, their Bertillon measurement card, terms such as, for their complexions, ruddy, florid, medium, and mild are just a few of the labels used to describe poor whites. Their nation of origin also are signifying categories in some of the earlier versions. You don't see it so much here, but in the museum, the collection at the Missouri Museum, most notable, you'll see Irish or Italian. These are examples of what historian Kelly Lytle Hernandez in her history of incarceration in California described as talks about how at one time mass incarceration actually impacted white men, that white men were the primary largest category of people incarcerated, and that these were men who were refused to be landowning, bound by heteronormative ideas of family. They often were engaged in same-sex practices, and they were nomadic. They would move around, and they made up the largest majority of incarcerated people in the late 19th and early 20th century. Okay, on one sheet of the mugshots in the Walther collection are 3 portraits, one of a black woman and 2 perhaps of white men, and I say perhaps of white men because of the category of whiteness as being produced largely through these indexes. They're stacked and arranged in ways that we come to perceive of institutional portraits. She is the only black woman, the only woman who appears at all in the Walther collection. Her presence among men speak to how the category of woman was also being produced by the carceral regime. So we have these racial production, but also gender categories. As historian Sarah Haley writes in looking at what she describes as Jim Crow carcerality and the impact specifically on black women, this is a quote from her research on Georgia, that 1908 laws establishing chain gangs to replace the notorious convict lease system codified the category of woman and female as racially specific subject positions. White women constituted a separate and unique class of persons defined as female who would be protected from the brutal throes of the chain gang, while criminalized black women positioned outside of the category of female would be routinely forced to labor on public roads and as domestic servants in white homes. And in addition to that, in the research I've done looking at a history of mugshots and prison ID portraits, which are portraits that are taken of all carceral subjects once they've been sentenced and incarcerated, that there are these examples of black women, photographic records, who were incarcerated in men's prisons. And they appear as archival subjects. They're treated like one of the testimonials that Sarah Haley mentions in her book as, quote, like a man. And I want to hold on to this image of this woman, her seemingly odd presence actually codified in law, because it leaves traces of the other ways in which black women are deeply impacted, their subjectivity, in fact, constituted in relationship to carceral regimes, even though women make up 7% of the current prison population. Black women, I argue in my work, are one of the groups most disproportionately impacted by incarceration because of the ways that it reproduces poverty among black women and the emotional and gendered labor involved in maintaining relations with incarcerated relatives. And so I'll return to some of these images in a few minutes. But what I want to say first is that these mugshots, I contend throughout my book that's coming out next year, haunt all images, all artwork, all cultural practices made by incarcerated people, such as these photographs from early 1980s that were taken by incarcerated people at Lorton Correctional Facility in Virginia. They were part of a photo workshop taught by a photographer and educator named Karen Ruckman, who's actually who just is working on a documentary about her work inside this prison in the early 80s called Inside Lorton's Dark Room. Most of the men imprisoned there were from the Washington, D.C. area, a city radically remapped and depopulated by mass incarceration and the war on drugs. And during the period of the workshop is really notable because it's the early to mid 80s, and Ruckman mentions how over the period that she ran the workshop, she saw the numbers of incarcerated people mushroom exponentially in just a few years, and also the population get younger and younger. Incarcerated men were taught all stages of photography, including working in a developing room that operated in the prison. The workshop stopped actually as the population got larger and larger, and the rules governing incarceration got more austere. You see this cutting away of programming and educational opportunities. The everydayness of photographs by incarcerated people at Lorton are framed against the rise of mass incarceration, the war on drugs, and its devastating impact on Black communities in D.C. and Maryland. And they're also framed around the issues of immobility, surveillance, and violence associated with the institution. So part of my question, and I'm glad Tina started by talking about what the vernacular means in this contemporary context, because I'm asking myself, I use vernacular a lot to talk about the work by incarcerated people. I've used it in some published work I have, but I'm not sure if it's an appropriate or accurate or useful category to talk about incarceration in states of unfreedom. So that's something I would like to discuss with our group, when during Q&A. So here's a photograph actually from a family day that happens in the prison yard at Lorton, and where the relatives of incarcerated people were able to come from one day and practice some of the activities and educational opportunities available. So the roots of my research are also in family and family albums, specifically my own family's relationship with incarceration. And I started doing this research by writing about a set of images of my incarcerated relatives. And I know some of you who know me are familiar with these images. But I was raised in a town in southwest Ohio that's deeply impacted by mass incarceration, where all my male cousins were incarcerated by the time they were 18. And so here are some photos of me posing with two of my cousins, Alan and DeAndre, who are the subject of much of my research, and have collaborated and participated in programming with me. So these are images from our visits to incarcerated relatives. So stop here. These I have described in the past as vernacular photographs. I don't know if I agree that they're vernacular photographs now. They are photographs that take place in the prison visiting room. They're photographed by an incarcerated photographer who's hired, that's his or her prison job. And they're sold to incarcerated people and their relatives as, tokens to kind of mark the visit, and to, as what I say, these kind of haptic objects that maintain relationships and connections, often over long prison sentences, like my cousin Alan, who was incarcerated for 18 years to life at the age of 18. So these visual documents complicate how we understand vernacular everyday photos. They are not aspirational images. They're not even everyday or quotidian, given how constructed and artificial they are in every way, including how we hug, how we smile, because we're also bound by all the conventions of touching and gestures inside prison. But they are, however, important objects of belonging for most of people impacted by incarceration, and for the millions who are entangled in some way in the carceral states. I'm just showing you a couple more. They are also images. I'm partly thinking about how prison images or images that are meant for family have entered museum spaces or kind of institutions of display, and the ethics of that. And these images have circulated more broadly in public culture in the past 10 years, largely because of an interest in mass incarceration, but also because of, I have 0 minutes remaining, also because of funds like Agnes Gunn's Art for Justice and the like. So these are actually photographs from Dina Lawson's project, where she exhibits images of her cousin Jasmine, whose partner was incarcerated, and they're called. But she also reframes them through a Black woman's narrative. They're called Jasmine and Family instead of Eric, who's the incarcerated person and family. And then I want to end by showing you another way that these narratives kind of get reframed through contemporary art practices is Sable Elise Smith, whose father was sent to prison when she was 10, and she uses a lot of these, quote, vernacular images or prison photos to actually kind of play with the pliability of prisons and prisons narratives, so she doesn't want people to use these images or see these images as biographical. Instead, she thinks about them in terms of composition, color, and how she can kind of reconfigure the narrative. And so here are a set of images from prisons that she has turned into an abstract collage. And then I just want to end by saying my cousins are out, and this is a picture of Alan and DeAndre at a recent opening of Aperture's Prison Nation in Cleveland, where they came up to visit. And I'm thinking about Alan still posing against the Carcel backdrop with the Prison Nation sign behind him. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Lily Cho. Please welcome Lily Cho.
Thank you. I would love to be Laura too. So it all worked out. Thank you so much. I do want to echo everyone's thanks to Tina, Mariana, Brian for all of the work they've done in bringing us together for this important conversation. I also want to thank in particular Remy Onabanjo and Sarah Softness for their help in navigating the Walther collection. They just did tremendous work for those of us who are new to the collection. In my presentation today, I'm going to give you a sort of overview and then take you through the images. In my presentation today, I want to explore the vernacular photography in the Walther collection in terms of the relationship between capture, captivity, and captivation. I'm particularly interested in the ways in which the vernacular image is frequently the site of visual captivity, but then how the image itself reemerges as a space that moves dialectically between capture and captivation. Relatedly, I want to understand this relationship between capture, captivity, and captivation as connected to a long history of the use of identification photography for producing non-citizens. So for me, the non-citizens aren't simply there as refugees, undocumented workers, or historically slaves, women, and so on, or not even historically, even now. So even though the figure of the non-citizen has been central to guaranteeing the existence of citizenship, and so if you read all these theories of citizenship, they all say the figure of the non-citizen is central to the emergence of the citizen. What I have found is that there's been actually very little work in thinking about how we come to the figure of the non-citizen and the specific processes by which non-citizens are produced and constructed. In the research that I've conducted so far, and my sort of entree into this work has really been, I've spent the last decade or so working with 40,000 identification photographs of Chinese migrants in Canada. This particular set of photographs constitutes the first mass use of ID photography in Canada, and it's an extraordinary collection, which I can talk about another time, but has some connection to some of the material I'll talk about today. So in that research that I've conducted so far, identification photography has been a central technology of non-citizenship almost from its inception. Understanding identification photography as a technology of non-citizenship does not, of course, mean that it is purely repressive. There are all kinds of modes of agency embedded within this photographic genre. And one site of possibility for the articulation of this agency lies, for me, in the rigorous examination of the movement between capture and captivation. And there are some historical connections between Chinese migration and the migrant workers that I'll be looking at in the images today, but I don't really have time to walk you through it. There are some really interesting historical materials available on that. Happy to talk about that another time. I was asked to think about some of the images in the collection related to the Migrants Series in the Walther collection, and I really spent a lot of time with them and a lot of intense. For me, they were intensely interesting. Here are a few of them. So there are a few obvious things. Even though these images have clearly been made within the genre of identification photography, right? Front-facing, plain backdrop, flat light, subjects indexed to identification numbers, they are also curiously lacking in one major element of identification portraiture, the names of their subjects. We have bodies and faces and numbers written on white cards and held up at chest level most of the time, but no names, not one. Right from the start, as identification photographs, the images in the Migrant Series beget more questions than most. And there is, I'm, at some point I'd love to talk to Sarah or Brian about how you construct the metadata for the images you have, because I did find the information interesting. I was given, and I hope it's okay that I share this, the details on the Migrant Series. Oh, sorry, I'm going to give you a few close-ups. Sorry. So here are a few close-ups. So there are 143 of them, and we'll talk about that. So here is the information on the series that came with some the supplementary information that I was given that came with this series. So 114 sequentially numbered, though some numbers are missing. The only ones not scanned are the 5 dupes and 1 alternate image. Is this Arthur? I don't know who the I is in this. I meant to ask. I know pretty much nothing about the images. I bought them from a dealer on the West Coast. I think the fact that they are migrant workers working in some sort of agricultural area is a pretty solid guess. The names on the hats of some of those depicted indicate California agribusiness concerns. There's obviously no guarantee that the men and women depicted actually worked for that concern. They're all 4x6 color commercial printed snapshots, my guess. It's from the 90s or very early 2000s. So that's some information. But of course, it's information that as a researcher, and you really just as a viewer coming to these images in a first instance, you probably, you read this and you think, whoa, I need a lot more, right? I really want to know a lot more about what's happening here. And I think that tension between the aporia of information available on a lot of vernacular, or what we might call vernacular images, or images of capture, or even identification photos, and the tension with the profound amount of information you do get is something that's worth thinking about and teasing apart. So even with the images that I work with in my own normal research, I have a lot of information, but there's also a lot I don't know. I don't know who the photographer is. Right, I don't know where the studios are. One of the things about these images is that they're so provocative, but they also are partly provocative because they, for me, demand the kind of wild, just a wild set of questions. So in contrast to the howling absence of information in the Migrants series, there are the G&G Precision Employee ID cards that Brian showed the badges yesterday, but the Walther collection also has the actual ID cards. So the G&G Precision workers, G&G Precision still operates today. I went and looked up their company website. They are steel manufacturers. They still carry on the work that we see captured here. The Walther collection has a number of these. I'm only going to show you a few. But I just wanted you to get a sense of how much information you get in these, in contrast to the Migrants series. Right? So these are employee ID cards, and yet you have biometric information, right? You have height and weight and eye color and hair color. You have signature and counter signature from, I think, a managerial figure. You have citizenship status. I did go through every one of the ID cards that I was given to look at, and I didn't find a single non-citizen in the G&G series. So if there are some, I didn't see them, but I did go through them all. So it's like for me, it was so great to have a sense of just these wild differences in terms of how we understand labor and the tracking of the laboring body in relation to ideas of capture. So in contrast to the G&G Precision Worker series, in the Migrant series we have, again, as I'm putting it, very little. The technologies of non-citizenship are uneven. Sometimes, as with the Chinese migrants in my current research, there is a lot of information, not unlike what you see on the G&G cards. But one of the things that this unevenness, I think, helps us to get to is the way in which the non-citizen occupies so many different kinds of positions. So the citizen is one thing. You are a citizen, you're not. But if you're a non-citizen, you can be all kinds of different things. And so the non-citizen can be a refugee, an undocumented worker, a migrant. And the sheer absence of information reveals so much about the technology of non-citizenship, the processes by which non-citizens are made. And I really think that photography is a technology which makes the non-citizen and has been central to the making of non-citizens. It's a dynamic process that continues. And make no mistake, non-citizens aren't simply just there. They have to be constructed over and over and over again. So here in the Migrant series, we have only the barest apparatus in place. We have the yellow stool, the makeshift white backdrop, the white cards with the numbers, and the clothes as signifiers. But these things, so in terms of capture, these things that repeat, the yellow stool, the white sheet, the cards, I want to suggest function as a kind of trap, and I'll clarify that. So I think of them as a trap in terms of the infrastructure of photographic capture with the intention to entrap. Indeed, the identification photograph is a trap. The objective of the trap is to entice prey into a structure which then closes in on itself. But the trap is not so clever because its logic is binary. One is either in or out. The trap does not see beyond the limits of its binarism. It can't imagine a space or horizon that is outside of the entrapment it engenders. And in this thinking, I'm partly expanding on some of the thinking that Ray Chow has been doing in a quite different context on Madame Bovary, but that's a different story. But I did find her thinking about entrapment really interesting. And just as a very brief addendum, I know I don't have as much time as I want, but I do think that in this sense, right, there's a really lovely connection to the Mistaken Identities, the Gender Benders series in the Walther collection, because there is something so non-binary about wanting to understand the experience of captivation put against the trap or entrapment. So in its binary nature, the trap functions along the lines, I think, of heteronormativity. It is not only an index to uneven social relations, but also revelatory of the ways in which queer desire circumvents the trap of binarism by exploiting the failure of this in or out logic to consider modes of existence that refuse one or the other. But we know that repressive photography is never entirely or wholly repressive. We know that the subjects of capture have agency. And in looking for that agency, I want to think about the relationship between capture and captivation in the final minutes of my talk here. So like capture, captivation is involuntary. But captivation does not carry the threat inherent in capture. Captivation is momentary, it can be fleeting. The captivated eventually look away. When the trap snaps shut, when the door closes, when the shutter snaps, there is what Ray Chow identifies as, quote, the shock of ensnarement, the pain of possible annihilation, end quote. One can be lost in a trap, one can lose something of oneself, but once caught, the trap cannot prescribe, and this is also important, the experience of capture. And so to me, one of the sites of potential agency for looking at photographs of, identification photographs particularly of non-citizens, has been to think about what that experience of captivation might be within the experience of capture. What kinds of spaces are being made? I'm going to skip the quote. Captivation is unstable. It can turn in a moment. And instability and unruliness are as much a part of captivation as the breathless stillness of beholding something beautiful. Captivation is, and here I'm going to quote from Ray Chow again, a collaboration of intensities, sensuous and imaginary, end quote. It is also what remains when the captured subject is deep in the instability of the experience of entrapment. The captivated are both those within the photograph and those who behold it. Captivation as an experience moves across the categories of captive and captor. And so, I want to close by looking at returning back to the Migrants Series. We look, and I really think it's hard to look away. When we do, we know that we have seen something, even if we do not always know what. A particular look, a smile, the clothes which do and do not signify. But the captor cannot know the experience of the captive. The trap cannot account for it. The trap does not know this experience. And I don't want to emphasize the experience of capture, but I also want to keep alive the possibility of captivation within the trap itself. There is the possibility of looking into the lens, of looking back, of seeing something of oneself in that looking, and of saying something that perhaps cannot be said any other way. And so I'm going to close with this image. It's bracketed as number 5 in the series. And I want to consider the trap of visibility, in terms of Tina's urgent call to think about what is unsayable in the genre of identification photography and how we have to learn to listen to that unsayability. And it seems to me that there's a vocality of refusal. In this image, the subject holds the numbered card, but he does so askew. His identification number is illegible. There's also, and so here we have the frequency of possibility, frequency borrowing from Tina's extraordinary thinking on this work. Within the experience of capture, there is the possibility of captivation. Look, keep looking, listen. Thank you.
And our next speaker is Ali Bedhad.
Thank you very much, the organizers, for inviting me. I'm not going to name you all. It's been wonderful. I'm very honored to be here. Let me just a couple qualifications. My paper might already be belated. I'm in the business of belatedness. But given our discussions yesterday, so I apologize for that. I also like to apologize for the fact that I did not use the Walther's collection. I'm one of those people who needs to work on something for a little bit for some time before I can write about it. I tell people that I need a little bit more time to do it. But the good citizen that I am, I did address all of them, imagining the everyday life, vernacular photography, which I believe that there is actually a category of vernacular photography, and portraiture, which was the topic of this. So without further ado, I would like to read you, and I think my paper should be 15 minutes. I think I timed it. After all these years of being an academic, I still kind of think. How can photography be restored to its own history? And how can we ensure that this history will be both materially grounded and conceptually expansive, just like the medium itself? Asks Jeffrey Batchen. The place to start in answering these compelling questions, he maintains, is what has always been excluded from photography's history, namely ordinary photographs, the photographs that preoccupy the home and the heart, but rarely museums or the academy. Batchen argues persuasively that historians of photography have no choice but to ignore the vernacular photographs, because to deal with it directly would be to reveal the shadow sacred artifice of their historical judgment and of the notion of artwork on which it is based. These are all quotations from him, incidentally. Put otherwise, in calling for an engagement with vernacular photography, particularly in the context of the domestic space, Bachin hopes to introduce a material historical approach to photography that moves beyond the formalistic art historical narrative of photography's history. Bachin is right, of course, to draw attention to this lacuna in photography's history. But the question still remains as to what kind of history vernacular photographs can tell. Does vernacular photography offer a resistant history, one that renders obsolete the traditional narrative of photography's history? And do vernacular photographs themselves maintain an oppositional relation to what Alan Sekula has described as photography's honorific and repressive functions? Post-colonial historians of photography have tended to answer these questions in the affirmative. For example, in his anthropological study of contemporary Indian portrait photography from Nagda region, Christopher Pinney has suggested that vernacular photographic traditions could creatively deform the geometrical spatialization of colonial worlds, unquote, and give rise to what he calls vernacular modernism. Photographic portraits of Nagda people, he has argued, are neither about identification nor surveillance, but about the, quote, manipulation of a repertoire of signs signifying possible states of being. Unlike their European counterparts, these images do not seek to impose a category of identity plucked from a pre-existing structure, but rather emerge as a creative space in which new aspirant identities and persona can be conjured. Other critics, like Stephen Sprague, Deborah Poole, and Heike Barnard, have made similar arguments about the oppositional possibilities of vernacular photography in the context of Yoruba portrait photography, early 20th century photographic portraited in Peru, and Likoni ferry photographs in Kenya, respectively. While Pinney's and Bachin's and these critics' contribution to the study of photography's other histories are salutary, these and other post-colonial critics problematically posit an oppositional view of vernacular photography as the return of the repressed. For Bachin, for example, vernacular photography, at least until yesterday, is the absent presence that determines this medium's historical and physical identity. Similarly, according to Pinney, vernacular photography in India and Africa constitutes a form of visual decolonization and a provincializing strategy by relocating the historical agency and centrality of Western representational practices in a new space, that of a non-metropolitan photographic practitioners whose refusal of a certain form of signification owes more to an ethical, political distaste of the totalizing schema and imprisoning referentiality than a reading of Clement Greenberg. In my talk today, I want to put pressure on these celebratory views of vernacular photography by exploring the ways in which ordinary photographs of everyday life can also project ideologically problematic forms of class and gender identities, something that now Bachin seems to agree with. Although Bachin is correct in claiming that any study of vernacular photograph must, of course, trace the presence of the past, but as an erasure, an absent presence fissured through and through by differences and contradictions that motivating the object in the present, such a critical task may not always lead to a discovery of oppositional form of photographic representation, nor would it necessarily yield a radically different history of photography. In one of my research trips to Iran, my mother, who had been following my research interest in photography with skeptical curiosity, gave me several boxes of dry gelatin glass plates and a few original prints dating back to the early 20th century. The plates and the photographs, which she had kept in an old chest in our basement since her family's home in the city of Sabzawar, had been demolished to build a new apartment building, belonged to my grandfather, who she told me was one of the first people in Sabzawar, small town, to take amateur photographs of his family and friends. Although I knew my grandfather was a mutajaddid, a non-traditionalist man, I was never told by anyone in my family that he dabbled in photography when he was younger, a kind of a shadow figure in this way. Nor did I know about the early appearance of amateur photography in small Iranian provincial towns until then. My mother later shared with me that my grandfather, who learned photography from a teacher from Azerbaijan, had taken many photographs of his family, including portraits of my religious grandmother posing without the hijab. But somehow the family had no traces of these images, even though my mother was certain that they had at one time existed. After an artist friend developed positive prints from the glass plates when I returned to Los Angeles, I was struck by the absence of my grandmother, and indeed female family members in my in the entire collection of photographs. Indeed, an entire collection featured only my grandfather and other male family members and friends posing individually or in groups. It seemed that a concerted effort had been made either to shield women from the gaze of the camera, or at one point images of women have been destroyed. Not only there were no traces of photographs of my grandmother or any other female family members, including my mom and her sisters, in the collection, but a plate in which, my grandmother may have appeared next to her young children had been scratched to erase her from the photograph. The absence of women in my grandmother's collection, I have concluded through my archival research, is not the exception, but the rule in early vernacular photography in Iran and the broader Middle East. With the exception of Armenian communities, Muslim Middle Eastern men tended to keep their wives and children and daughters away from the gaze of the camera in the name of religious piety. Iranian men in particular zealously embraced the notion of namus, a complex masculine and patriarchal ethos that demanded that they defend their women's chastity by shielding their wives and adult daughters from being seen by other men. While forbidding their wives and adult daughters to be photographed, bourgeois men in the Middle East, however, regularly photographed themselves and frequented professional studios to have their portraits taken, almost always in honorific fashion or poses. In my grandfather's collection, for example, he and other male members of the family and friends appear in individual and group portraits, often in erect and serious poses, to convey a sense of piety and grandeur. Instead of sitting on traditional Persian rugs, as was the custom at the time, the men almost always sit on chairs with such technological symbol of progress as clock, guns, binoculars, bicycles, and cars to underscore their access to these signifiers of privilege and power. As in the European tradition of photographic portraiture, my grandfather's photographs speak to the dialectics of the inner and the outer, the individual and the community, the psychological and the social. In the following photograph, for example, for a little bit later, my grandfather's serious expression, his rigid pose, calm demeanor, and melancholic expression convey his inner self as much as they represent his social status as a distinguished and ethical merchant. The portrait, John Tagg has argued, is a sign whose purpose is both the description of an individual and the inscription of social identity. At the same time, he posits, it is also a commodity, a luxury, an adornment, ownership of which itself confers status. That my grandfather is sitting on a chair instead of a carpet and is dressed in a European-style suit and hat posing in front of the white sheet that blocks any sense of his domestic surrounding or external references speak to a desire for self-fashioning as a modern figure. Idealization of the sitter in this instant is not a means of escape, but an affirmation of his privileged bourgeois self. In other words, photographic representation offered middle-class men with the means to conjure an image of modern subjectivity. In the absence of any reference to his social and familial context, my grandfather's portrait is meant to foreground individualism, modernity, and progress, values associated at the time with the West. Although my grandfather's adoption of Western fashion and self-representation should not be viewed as a passive form of imitation, it nonetheless underscores how such indigenous representation of bourgeois self were aimed to emulate European notion of modernity and progress. Emulation of Western modernity are most evident in awkward inclusions of objects such as clock, binoculars, and European furniture in portrait photography. These examples that I'm showing you here are of how such technological devices were included in individual group portraits to highlight the social class and modernize subjectivity of men. The clock in the first and third photograph, in this one, and the binocular in the second one, are meant to demonstrate the sitter's access to these symbols of progress, thus highlighting not only their privileged social status, but also their modern subjectivity. In these images, the sitters aim to distinguish themselves from subaltern classes by underscoring their access not only to modern technological devices, but also to the very means of photographic self-representation, as is demonstrated by the inclusion of the previously taken photographs in the photograph. The presence of photograph in the photograph underscores the sitter's understanding of photographic image as luxury, the expression of which confers social status. Still, as examples of portrait photographic grafting, these images do not merely mimic Western iconography. The handwritten text or the Persian carpets in these photographs are contextual references that mark them as Iranian. The inclusion of these elements speaks to the desire to fashion an indigenous mode of self-representation that is culturally unique, aesthetically particular, and visually legible to local audience. Nonetheless, the prominence of the clock in the middle of the first and third photograph, and that of binocular in the second, foreground the centrality of the West in representation of male subjectivity in this case. While the first and third images, the European clock links the sitter with the Western temporality, the binocular in the second associates the sitter with Western technologies of visibility. As idealized images of selves, these photographs displace the traditional and the community or the communal, focusing instead on signifiers of capitalist modernity to represent their subjects. While Middle Eastern men projected the notion of modern subjectivity onto photographic portraiture, they nonetheless espoused traditional values as fathers and patriarchs. Early Iranian family portraits provide ample examples of how photography was used to reaffirm traditional gender roles. In all of these photographs, fathers and patriarchs are symbolically positioned in the center, often seated on a chair to highlight their privilege as the head of the household. Next to them are the oldest sons to mark their secondary position in the family hierarchy. The stark absence of mothers and older daughters in these photographs further underscores their marginalized roles within the family structure, an absence that also speaks to a notion of male honor that I have mentioned, that prevents the public exposure of respectable and virtuous women. When the underage daughters do appear, as in the last photographs, they are carefully positioned the furthest from the head of the family. Further testifying to the marginal role of women in Iranian society. The photographs, in other words, illustrate that the adoption of photography by Iranians or Middle Easterners, I would generalize, was neither a passive act nor a sign of transition from tradition to modernity. Rather, it was a deliberate attempt to use the new medium to represent and reaffirm their social status and traditional values. Put otherwise, portraiture in this case was not merely an inscription or representation of a social identity, but productive of it. Both as material object and as means of representation, the family portrait helped construct the modern patriarchal bourgeois subject. Where there is power, Michel Foucault reminds us, there is resistance. And yet, or rather consequently, this resistance is never in a position of exteriority in relation to power. The relational character of power, Foucault argues, means that there is no single locus of great refusal, no soul of revolt, source of all rebellions, or pure law of revolutionary, but instead a multiplicity of points of resistance, some of which function as support or handle in power relations. Foucault's theoretical insight, let me conclude, about the relational character of power offers a productive context to complicate post-colonial critics' celebratory views of vernacular photography, which describes it solely in terms of agency and resistance. My discussion of vernacular photography, in other words, has aimed to demonstrate that to the extent to which it is possible to be both the subject and object of representation, vernacular photographs do not necessarily constitute a locus of opposition in relation to the official and dominant form of photographic representation. For their European counterparts, in this case, Middle Eastern men utilize the camera in its honorific function to produce idealized portrait of masculinity, to reaffirm their social status, and in an exclusionary fashion to consolidate their patriarchal power over women. And as such, the history of vernacular photography in the Middle East is not necessarily an alternative history of photography, or does not provide us with an alternative history of photography either. Thank you.
And our final speaker is Laura Wexler.
Thank you, and I still want to thank Tina Campt and Marianne Hirsch and Brian Wallace and Sarah Softness and everybody else who's made this occasion possible for us to have this discussion, which is really getting intensely fascinating. Is it? Yeah. Oh, okay. So, and I have to say that I flew in, I had a kind of collision of schedules, and I flew in last night. I arrived at 1:30 in the morning from St. Louis, and so therefore I missed what is a discussion that I'm actually partaking in, as you will see. And so I'm a little bit, I'm elated in the sense that I don't exactly know what you already talked about, but I'm going to add my 2 cents, and we'll see about it. So here's a quote from Barthes. Ultimately, photography is subversive, not when it frightens, repels, or even stigmatizes, but when it is pensive, when it thinks. So, thought I, what is the origin of the word vernacular? And you'll recognize this, I think. Oops, I can't. Early 17th century, the Oxford English Living Dictionary says, from the Latin vernaculus, domestic, native, from verna, homeborn slave. According to Merriam-Webster, vernacular was brought into the English language as early as 1601 from the Latin vernaculus, native, which had been in figurative use in classical Latin as, quote, national and domestic, having originally been derived from vernus and verna, a male and female or female slave, respectively, born in the house rather than abroad. The figurative meaning was broadened from the diminutive extended words vernaculus, vernacula. Varro, the classic Latin grammarian, used the term vocabula vernacula, terme de la langue nationale, or vocabulary of the national language, as opposed to foreign words, unquote. Our associations to the vernacular are now very often to the everyday, to the ordinary, to the resistant realm of domesticity, comfort, familiarity, ease. But the dictionary references slavery. The vernum is the national or the homeborn slave. Thus, rather surprisingly to me, the vernacular is that which is owned by the slave power. The vernacular is the materialization of force, of bondage and servitude. It is the fruit of an intimate, homeborn oppression. It is the distinction of nation, and it is what maintains the national distinction in the prison house of a national language. The vernacular is quite literally the master's tool. I am thinking thus less about how vernacular photography configures our particular apprehension of the ordinary, which clearly it does, to, quote, shape, sort, segregate, and categorize citizens based on occupation, social group, body type, or political affiliation. Rather, I am wondering about how all this labor the vernacular does to seize the ordinary has been rendered unspeakable and opaque. Benjamin speaks of the potential of photography as a release from the boredom of the everyday. Quote Benjamin, "Our taverns and our metropolitan streets, our offices and our furnished rooms, our railroad stations and our factories appeared to have us locked up hopelessly. Then came the film and burst this prison world asunder by the dynamite of the tenth of a second, so that now, in the midst of its far-flung ruins and debris, we calmly and adventurously go traveling." Unquote. But Benjamin, dare we say, has got it wrong, it seems. It seems to be the other way around. We should no longer hope that photography will serve, as Benjamin puts it in his thesis on the philosophy of history, as our guide, flaring up to illuminate a moment of danger. Rather, it is our lockup that the vernacular photograph helps deliver. That photography with which we have an intimate everyday relation is what does the dirty work. So in what does this violence consist? I would argue that it has something to do with the kind of time that a photograph creates. That is to say, a before and an after. Once there is a photograph, there is an event. The viewer says, something has happened, but nothing has happened to her. What has really happened is a change in the relationship between the photographed subject and those who authored it. For the person brought before a camera, there must be a pose. She must have a place to lie or sit or stand. Thus far is unexceptional. But if then the photographed subject continues to live, to suffer, and perhaps to dream, the after of this living is undisplayed. Even as she may be radically changing, photography has fixed the photographed person in the time of the before. You can see the justification for anger. Continuity is no longer an ongoing series of moments, but a mashed-up climax, which then obstructs the next. It is not the so-called capture that is the problem, I'm beginning to think. It is the fix. The fix is both an address to the anxiety of disappearance, and it is an anxiety itself. The founding moment of 19th century photography is, as we know, not when they were able to capture images, because people could do that for hundreds of years, but when they were able to fix the captured image. The capacity to undo the fugitivity of the image and force it to remain is what identified the photographic image as photographic. Why the need for permanence? What was it impossible to recognize? Why was it impossible to recognize photography as such until the fix? It is at least possible to imagine an apparatus of photographic images and a practice of circulation that does not require duration. Indeed, I think Snapchat is teaching a whole generation to focus on those pleasures. This has to do, I think, with the emergency that photography has seen to intervene in. In a century in which everything, quoting Marshall Berman and others, everything rises and melts into air, some people's lives are increasingly valuable while the situation of others is rendered immutable. The fix represents an anxiety to settle how things will be and to cover over insurgent possibilities. In the Walther collection is a set of 12 photographs of asylum inmates that strike me as especially cruel. Here is an intractable problem, insanity, and a tool to render it other. The men are pictured mainly in their hospital clothing. Okay, so that's another set. Okay. The photograph scene is working hard to announce that the warden has things under control. Obviously, something is very wrong. They're mostly in their institutional clothes, and this is a registry of great pain and of the violence that the insane often experience. Yet the photographers and the assistants go out of their way to add a supplement. I would like to add, therefore, a category to Sekula's famous duality that structures the shadow archive, the honorific and the repressive. I would like it to read honor, repression, assault. In deliberate and gratuitous cruelty, the men are photographed when they are looking at something else rather than at the camera. Of course, we cannot know for sure, but it seems that they have been deliberately distracted by something that is calling for their attention above and to the side. The shutter is opened and shut while they glance away. Like the technique of photographing infants by waving a toy, this is a way of orchestrating the gaze, but the infant sees a toy that lines up with the gaze of the lens, so that an illusion of interiority and intersubjectivity takes place. Here, just the opposite. The men in the asylum are denied what a moment before and a moment after they are perfectly capable of doing. As Benjamin remarks in the short history, the early Hill and Adamson photographs, the early Hill and Adamson photographs portray an interiority so intense, so shy of the camera, quoting Benjamin, that Hill's models were not all that far from the truth when they said they felt the phenomenon of photography still to be a great mysterious experience, even if this feeling was no more than the consciousness of standing in front of an instrument which in the briefest space of time could produce a picture of the invisible surrounding world which did appear to them as alive and real as nature itself. It was said of Hill's camera, Benjamin continues, that it maintained a discreet reserve, but his models were no less reserved. They preserved a certain shyness before the camera, and the motto of the later photographer of and the motto later developed by photographers: "Don't look at me." And it was commented, people were afraid at first to look for any length of time at the pictures that Hill and Adamson produced. They were embarrassed by the clarity of these figures and believed that the little tiny faces of the people in the pictures could see out at them. So amazed did the unaccustomed detail and the unaccustomed truth to nature of the first daguerreotype pictures appear to everyone. But these photographs have sought to strip the photographed person even of that shy interiority. To be without interiority would be to be entirely insane. The photography produces this insanity as it pretends merely to record it, and the emergency of what to do with the population of the mentally ill is thereby controlled. Don't worry. You will return from this anxious encounter with the incarcerated. We know what to do. We've got the problem fixed. Except, of course, as Susan Marcellus, Wendy Ewald, Ariella Azalea, Lee Rayford, and I are proposing in what we call Cluster 1 of our project, Collaboration, A Potential History of Photography. The photographed person is always there. Each of these men may be cataloged, sorted, and stored as insane, and thus in need of asylum, but notwithstanding, each is not fixed. Insanity does not remove him from the encounter. This encounter is registered. He endures it. And in that endurance is also a work of the everyday, an effort, sometimes mighty, of the insane to persist against the fix. How might this opacity of this labor be undone? In what ways could students of the vernacular make visible photography's constitutive and an ongoing entanglement with those who have been relegated to the ashes of history? Photography, says Barthes, is violent, not because it shows violent things, but because on each occasion it fills the sight by force, and because in it nothing can be refused or transformed. That we can sometimes call it mild does not contradict its violence. Many say sugar is mild, but to me sugar is violent, and I call it so. This suggests that if we slow up the all-at-onceness of the photograph, there can be a transformation in how we see it working. The chain of events between before and after begins to disintegrate. That is to say, such a transformation is not about what vernacular photographs are pictures of, but of how quickly or slowly we permit all the components to resolve. The bum's rush is at the master's bidding. Enclosure is the problem. We need to escape this fix, this repair. Thank you.